Good morning. I'm Elizabeth Emery. I'm a professor of French in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures at Montclair State University. So I've been asked to present today on my research regarding 19th and 20th century France and America. And so what I'd like to do today is to ask, how many of you have gone to the Metropolitan Museum of Art to look at some of the Impressionist paintings, walk through some of the European galleries? Excellent. So quite a few of you have seen galleries like this with paintings like the one on the right by Edgar Degas of Dancers at the Bar. Now, I'm curious how many of you actually look at those little labels that you can see on the right-hand side. Yeah? Oh, good. Okay, because I have a confession to make. I'm a little bit of a nerd about looking at the labels. I'm interested in who collected the paintings, where they came from, and how they got to the museum. So if we zoom in on this one, it's a little too small, but you can see that it was given as part of a collection of H.O. Havemeyer, who was known as the Sugar King because his family had a monopoly on the sugar industry in 19th century America. So H.O. Havemeyer collection. And in fact, this is fairly typical for most of the paintings in this gallery and that they came from the collections of powerful men. So the question is, what if I were to tell you that this was not actually collected by H.O. Havemeyer, but it was collected by his wife, Louisine? Because that, in fact, is the case. Louisine Havemeyer actually purchased this painting in France after her husband's death for $95,000, which at the time was the most anybody had ever paid for a work by a living artist. So she kept it in her New York, her Fifth Avenue mansion until her death at 1928, in which point she gave it to the Metropolitan Museum as a bequest. But she left all of these paintings and Japanese prints to the Met in the name of her husband, H.O. Havemeyer Collection. And if you're interested in reading more, there's a book called Splendid Legacy, the Havemeyer Collection, which talks a lot about this collection that's in itself kind of a small museum. And so my question for you is why? Why did she attribute this Degas painting to her husband when she was the one who purchased it? And what might this essentially a misleading label tell us about the labels that we find on other paintings in other museums and at the Met? Why do so few museum labels recognize the work of women collectors? And so these were the kinds of questions that haunted me when I was working on a book I have forthcoming in January. It's called Reframing Japonisme, and it talks about the forgotten influence of many of the women and artists who participated in a developing interest for Japanese art. People kept saying, well, women weren't interested in collecting art and Japanese art. But I kept finding all of these letters, memoirs, stories showing that 19th century women did collect art and they really appreciated it. So here you have an example of the daughter of the artist here looking at a Japanese print in a kimono in a work that was then inspired by the Japanese print. So women were interested, but when those works then appeared in museums, in expositions, in different places, the labels would always have the names of their husbands, their fathers, their brothers. So a key example that comes from my book is the work of Camels and Enmity. So this is the Musée d'Ennery, the d'Ennery Museum. She collected artworks from East Asia from about 1840 until her death in 1898. She donated then these 9,000 objects that she had curated. She built a house. This is the house she built. She organized these to give to the French state as the first free public museum of Asian art. And what's completely appalling from our point of view today is that although newspapers at the time said, oh, she's so generous, what a great bequest, after she died, not a single word about her name in the opening speech dedicating the museum. Her tombstone today doesn't have her name. She's buried with her husband, and there's no Wikipedia page. I'm working on that one, don't worry. So while I was trying to figure out how somebody who was recognized in her own time, who left a museum to the French state, a museum that exists today, could be so completely forgotten, I realized that how much in France the answer to this question about recognition comes from the legal tradition. with Napoleon Bonaparte and his Napoleonic Code of 1804, women were considered minors. So they were essentially children controlled by their husbands and fathers. Throughout most of the 19th century, they had no ability to inherit property. And so, unless they had a prenuptial contract, estates didn't go to wives when their husbands died. They went to the surviving children who were supposed to support their mothers. And most of them did, but you never know. So these legal conditions determining women's French property ownership went a long way to answering this question about why museum labels don't recognize women. For all intents and purposes, the artwork belonged to the husband. And so, legally speaking, the government said, well, we'll put his name on the museum. So as I kept digging into the archives, I realized that my answer about the labels had much more to do with social structures and legal structures that made it unacceptable for women to be labeled collectors than it did with women's true interest in art. Louisine Havemeyer, who so modestly asked that her husband's name be on the labels in the Met, did so even though she and her husband collected together. And in fact, we now know that she was a tremendously great collector in her own right. She was a painting she bought from Claude Monet, the Impressionist painter, in 1874. I don't know if anybody wants to guess how much she paid for it, since they now go for millions and millions of dollars. Here we go, $60 in 1874. It's considered to be the very first Monet that was brought to America. And this is before she was married. Louisine was a very good friend of Mary Cassatt, the Impressionist painter, from her time as a teenager in Paris. And Mary Cassatt helped her locate paintings, and she purchased them with her pocket money, essentially as a teenager. Again, before she married the robber baron, Havemeyer. She wasn't alone in doing this. She wasn't just an exceptional woman, although she was an exceptional woman. There are many other women, such as Marguerite Charpentier, we see here in a painting she commissioned from Renoir. Although it's a portrait of mother and children, it's also doing double duty. As you can see in the background, Renoir has captured her Japanese art collection, which she installed in, it was a trend-setting at the time, Japanese smoking room. The contributions of another woman, Anna Gons, who's sitting here at the center with her husband Louis on her right, our left, helped him write his books. She was also a collector. People of the time talked about this. But as you can see in her sort of subservient position here, she disappears from history. And this is in fact what happens. At the beginning of the 20th century, as memoirs published by the friends of figures such as this family start recording their memories of years prior, they focus on their own contributions. So this is Raymond Coquelin, who was an administrator at the Louvre, and his memoirs focus on Anna Gons's husband, right here, but Anna disappears, as do many of the other women who were involved in their social groups. They neglected to mention the sisters, the spouses, the daughters, who had helped write these books. So essentially what such silence did is it creates what art historian Julie Johnson has called a memory gap. And this is a kind of a void produced when those in power who are telling the stories and writing history neglect to inscribe other people into that story. And so this kind of memory gap developed not just for the Japanese art that I talk about in my book, but also for the Impressionist painters. And I don't know whether any of you went to the Barnes Foundation last fall to see it's a traveling exhibit. It's in Paris right now, but on Berthe Morisot. And she has been now rightfully restored as one of the leaders and organizers of the Impressionist groups at the end of the 19th century. So the stories I'm telling about memory gaps, like the one that Berthe Morisot fell into, have dealt specifically with 19th century examples. But the process of memory making and memory erasing continues today. And in my book, we see the story of a small, powerful group of men who write the story of their own contributions, thus leaving people out. They created a new field called Japonisme. And as you can see by my colleague Christopher Reed's recent book, it's pretty much thought that this is an entirely male-dominated field. If anyone had asked, the men writing these memoirs would have said, oh yeah, my sister helped me. Oh yeah, my wife, yeah, she bought that item. But because of the social and legal structures, they see themselves as having created this field. And the resulting invisibility of women and foreigners, because it wasn't just the women, it was also the Japanese friends who went to Japan, bought objects, and gave them to them or told them how they were important. This kind of invisibility of women and foreigners comes back to what Charles Mills has called the racial contract. It's quite a similar phenomenon of white male privilege that continues to influence the laws, the education, the artistic system in the United States, and also in many European countries today. Whether intentional or not, the works of powerful cultural figures like Coquelin, who was at the Louvre, end up enhancing their own reputations at the expense of the other people who participated in the publications or the exhibits. That pushes everybody else into a memory gap. Robin DiAngelo, in a recent book called White Fragility, notes that historically it's only been those in power, disproportionately white and male today, and I think these are fairly staggering statistics from her book. When you see this kind of power structure, the legal, the social structure, it can only be when people in these powerful positions acknowledge and include those who don't enjoy the same structures of power that the system becomes more equitable. She cites the example of how white women actually gained the vote in 1920, thanks to the men in power who were finally shamed into doing it, mostly because the women were going on hunger strikes, picketing, marches. And 1920 will be this. You'll hear a lot about the suffragette movement in the next year because this is the 100th year anniversary. So you may think I'm going off on a tangent here, but I'm not. I'm coming back, really. I'm coming back to Louisine Havemeyer, who was a major suffragette. She was rich, and so she had very high-profile support of the National Women's Party, which was really quite critical to turning the tide and influencing the men in power. At first, she simply donated funds and organized an exhibit. In fact, it was the only time she ever publicly showed her art collection. She charged $5 a head to come in and see it, and she gave all those proceeds to the women's movement. Progressively, as politicians kept refusing women the vote, this 63-year-old grandmother went on the road and marched, got sent to prison, and then this is part of a prison train. The 28 or 29 women who had been in prison went on a national tour by train to talk to legislators and make them change their minds about giving women the vote. This kind of suffragette activism that she was engaged in makes it completely horrifying that she wouldn't even acknowledge her own contributions when she gave gave all of the art collection to the Met in the name of her husband, to be called the H.O. Havemeyer Collection. I think we've seen that women can also be complicit in this kind of building of memory gaps by downplaying their own achievements. So she didn't acknowledge them, but she did acknowledge them. She wrote a book of memoirs for her children. So she kind of did the public, I'm very modest, and then the private, I am a great collector, memoirs of a collector. Without this publication, though, we would have no idea of how great a role collecting played in her life and what a great collector she was. So I began this talk with a story of my adventures in the archives, and I'll conclude with another. So these early 20th century scholars who privileged their own achievements by remaining silent about the contributions of 19th century women and minorities don't have to have the last word, right? All it takes is a trip to the archives, more and more of which are digitized, like this book. With those archives, we can shed new light on figures who have disappeared. And we can also shed new light on stories we've accepted, like those labels, without question. This is what Margot Lee Shetterly did for Math and Science by publishing Hidden Figures in 2016. It's also what the New York Times Overlooked series, and I don't know if you've been reading these, but these are really interesting. They have recognized the existence of a memory gap within their own socially constructed agenda at the New York Times, and they're publishing obituaries of figures who didn't get obituaries during their lifetime. Museums, too, as they try to better represent the contributions of people other than Gilded Age robber barons, like H.O. Havemeyer, they might consider telling more stories about the individuals. That could be employees, art dealers, foreigners, who did the legwork to locate the objects they then purchased and put their names on. The J.P. Morgan Library does this really well for Belle de Costa Green. Now, they've dedicated a portion of their website to her accomplishments in building what they call one of the most important collections of books and manuscripts in the United States. The Met continues to respect donor wishes in the labels, but they also use their website to give a little bit more context. So here we see that Louisine is credited for having purchased this painting. The internet, in fact, has proven instrumental in allowing curators to reframe works, to tell stories of hidden or overlooked figures who work to acquire and preserve them. And so if I come back to my initial question, why do so few museum labels recognize the contributions of women collectors? The answer is really because of old-fashioned social and legal conventions that made women's work invisible. Today we should recognize that labels like the one on the Degas painting flatten a very complex history. The internet, from museums to blogs, websites, Twitter, Wikipedia, they allow us to better understand the historical context that dictated these labels, created them, and to work together to fill the memory gap. Only 17% of Wikipedia entries today are dedicated to women, fewer to people of color. Anybody can participate in Wikipedia, so I invite you all to join in rewriting history. Thank you.